Who would have thought that they, the politicians, would go to work not in parliaments, but amongst the monuments? During the political crisis this summer about antisemitism and anti-Zionism, little has been remarked about the fact that the arena of politics has been the memorial, and the memorial here has taken both its oldest forms of the grave and the cemetery, albeit maybe snapped just instantaneously in a photograph that is reproduced years later, once everyone has forgotten, and its newest forms, the definition and the international diplomatic agreement. A question has been asked about what Jeremy Corbyn was doing on Holocaust Memorial Day, whether the survivor he was meeting with had the wrong sort of opinions, or perhaps he was the wrong sort of Jew. A definition is handed down by an institution that calls itself the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. And meanwhile, a question is raised about whether Corbyn is at the wrong cemetery, by the wrong graveside, for someone who ought to be forgotten. All the meanwhile, these great institutions of memorial culture have been left unquestioned and their history has not been told. And so perhaps, if we're to approach this question radically, we need to tell their history, a history of histories. The history of the Holocaust came late. In the immediate aftermath of the war, a few books were published, but it was not until very late on, the late 50s and the 1960s, that bigger histories began to appear, and that survivors began to tell their stories. Of course, by then, national myths had already occurred. In France, there was the resistance, of which everyone seemed to have taken a part, and Gaullism could become the popular politics of the day. While in Germany, the defeat of Nazism and what had happened under Nazi rule was simply not spoken about. And here in Britain, a mythology built up that we had been fighting the war in order to save the Jews, which is, of course, also a fabrication. And it's perhaps a coincidence that at the same time that these histories of the Holocaust came to the fore, that the big state went into decline. That big state that brought you both Auschwitz and the NHS, now both relics of one sort or another. The falling apart of the big state meant that social power was dispersed now into communities, to the point at which Thatcher could announce that society simply doesn't exist. And yet, the state still played a role comprised of those communities, mediating with them, mediating the relationship to individuals through them. And one of the main means during the decades that followed that the state could relate to those communities was through recognizing their troubled histories and pasts, and by inventing new institutions of memorial. It seems to me that the lateness of the history of the Holocaust is all too quickly made up for by the acceptance and unquestioning nature of the national memorials of the present, and perhaps they act as a mask or a repression of the fact that the past was simply never dealt with, and they hope, perhaps vainly, that they can turn that past into education, Yet today they act with power and force. I want to tell a story about some memorials that have not been mentioned in the paper this summer. In West Jerusalem, Israeli-controlled West Jerusalem, is a very old Muslim cemetery called Mamilla. And over the last decade it has been desecrated. Corpses have been disinterred and bones scattered, all in order that a new museum can be built there. The second Museum of Tolerance, a centre for human dignity, established by the Simon Wiesenthal Centre. This will be a Holocaust museum, a museum supposedly to fight off antisemitism, and it has support from the highest echelons of the Israeli state. There is in some way a relation to the politics this summer, though, because the Simon Wiesenthal Centre has rather a lot to do with the IHRA definition of antisemitism. In fact, Mark Weitzman, who is the Centre's Director for Government Affairs, is known as the IHRA definition's architect, and perhaps this is the correct term for someone who is involved in building over those corpses that will not be remembered and cannot be remembered. He hasn't been so quiet about what's been going on in the Labour Party either, and the Simon Wiesenthal Centre has been sending out communiques across the global press. A few days ago, Shimon Samuels, their Director for International Relations, described Momentum as a marriage of convenience between Trotskyite leftists and radical Islam. So this gives you a sense of their politics. All of this is to say that the claim that these institutions of memory and that the handing over of memory to communities is value-free or free from the exertion of power or force is simply false. And we ought to intervene. There is a tendency in politics today to see everything in the perspective of splitting perpetrators and victims, abusers and abused. There is a sense that those who are victims of the past can do no wrong or have the right to wield power. There is broadly a denial that those who are victims ever wield power in a way that might become tyrannical. And yet, this is precisely what we see from those communities that are handed power by the state. And it becomes something like a free-for-all, with those who are Palestinian victims and those who are Jewish victims set against each other. And we're simply told to wait and see who will win and who will emerge victorious, and who can instrumentalise the past enough to beat down the others who might also have pasts they want to redeem. The dissolution of the state leads to a politics of revenge or ressentiment. It wants to turn all past suffering into a sacrifice, and these sacrifices become the means in which communities are bound together. Who are we who want to stand outside the community? And who are we who don't want to have an instrumental relation to the past, who don't want to wield it against others? What can we do if we do not do that? Must we live in silence? I read a tweet by Luciana Berger, the right-wing Labour MP. She said, "Being present is the same as being involved. When I attend a memorial, my presence alone, whether I lay a wreath or not, demonstrates my association and support. There can also never be a fitting memorial for terrorists. Here, transmitted in the newest technology, is some of the oldest politics. Berger, it seems, is channeling the tyrant Creon from the tragedy of Antigone. Creon says that Polynices may have no burial, no man may touch him, or say the least prayer for him. He shall lie on the plain unburied, and the birds and the scavenging dogs can do to him whatever they like. Of course, Antigone will creep beyond the city walls and give her brother a burial, and she will be punished too, but at the same time will discover a divine law higher than Creon's law of the state. And Creon too will have his tragedy. But perhaps there is something more complex in Creon's position, for the unburied body is not simply there to be forgotten, but stands as a warning. In the refusal of a monument to Polynices is also some kind of memory, a type of memory that might make the tyrant neurotic, that might, in the hardening of those city walls and the deciding of their bounds and what is beyond them, conjure ghosts that will forever haunt him. Perhaps this is the alternative of the divine law, is simply a life of being haunted, of having to make those walls firmer and stronger and higher, to make the power of the state more forceful. One wonders why Berger wants to conjure Corbyn into the character of Antigone. But one can sense perhaps this is, she imagines a world without divine law. And so she knows that the only struggle there will be is a purely political one, of force, managed within the state between communities. And yet, in a strange way, she is as melancholic and obsessed with building walls as Creon was. She's not only uninterested in mourning a Palestinian who she claims is a terrorist, but she's also ultimately uninterested in mourning the Holocaust. Instead, she wants to be an eternal melancholic in order to justify those walls that she has built. And this she can call the state, and she can wield its power. She has no interest in confronting or negotiating with history, but simply wants to joyfully submit to all that was worst in it, in order to use it against others. She hopes, perhaps, that those ghosts will be on her side. And perhaps she is right. Where those without a fitting memorial died, there will be placed the most unfitting memorial of those more favoured. A baroque necropolis of tarmac and blood, adorned with armies with the most modern weaponry, and museums and bodies unburied. The most terrible history of Europe appears as a ballast. It acts as a counterweight that elevates a politics of despair, which at once turns into a politics of resignation, in which no intervention can be made into the past, and at the same time tries to wield fragments of that past to fight for the remaining scraps of power. This fragmented history, in which everything is turned into rubble, is a history without redemption. And so rather than taking sides in this politics that has circulated around monuments, which seems to be mourning and might just be melancholy, what does it mean to take up a radical politics against this rather than simply taking sides? Where do we stand in relation to these monuments? And do we need an anti-monumental memory? What sort of politics might interrupt this? Might bring to awareness those victims who only have an instrumental relation to the past? More recently, on the left, interventions into monumentalism have become common. In the States, Confederate statues have been smashed, and here in Britain, a campaign took place in Oxford against the statue of Rhodes. These actions seem rather hopeful insofar as, having recognised the power of monumentalism in our historical moment, they assume that the monuments are merely this power's spectacle, and they hope, as they break the charm or the idol, so too do they lift the spell it casts across humanity. I perhaps have less hope, and I am also less interested in smashing monuments. But we nonetheless have to make choices, such that those monuments don't become the hardened city walls that never allow the remembrance of people who we disagree with. Or we might turn into those IDF soldiers who earlier this year smashed another set of Palestinian graves of those who had risen up in 2015 in Jerusalem, simply because they were unhappy with the use of the word hero on the graves. We have to make choices about the Holocaust, whether we bear it within us or whether we expel it, and these choices might in turn out to be unbearable. And yet, without them, we are doomed to a politics of sacrifice, a politics at the same time that sacralizes the European Jews on behalf of a Europe that simply wants to annihilate its enemies and therefore complete the work of antisemitism.